Welcome to Teacher Sally YouTube channel. Today, we're going to talk about certain genetic terms to better understand how inheritance works. Are you ready? So let's get started. Genetic terminology. To understand how inheritance works, you need to know the definition of certain genetic terms and how to use genetic process to determine the characteristics of offspring. Genetics is the scientific study of heredity. Genetics is a branch of science that studies the DNA, genes, genetic variation, and heredity in living organisms. Genetics is the study of how different qualities, called traits, are passed down from parent to child. Genetics help explain what makes you unique, why family members look alike, and why some diseases run in families. When we trace the paths of these qualities, we are following packages of information called genes. Heredity refers to the passing of traits or characteristics through genes from one generation to other generation. Heredity is very evidently seen in sexual reproduction. This is because in this process, the variation of inherited characteristics is high. Heredity or hereditary is the process of passing the traits and characteristics from parents to offspring through genes. The offspring get their features and characteristics that is genetic information from their mother and father. Heredity and genetics are the reason you look so much like your parents. Trait. A trait is a specific characteristic that varies from one individual to another. These traits are described by the genetic information carried by a molecule called DNA. The instructions for constructing and operating an organism are contained in the organism's DNA. Every living thing on Earth has DNA in its cells. Example of trait includes brown hair, blue eyes, tall, and curly. Alleles. Alleles are the different possibilities for a given trait. Allele is a different form of a gene that codes for different version of characteristic. An allele is a variant form of a gene. Some genes have a variety of different forms, which are located at the same position or genetic locus on a chromosome. Humans are called diploid organisms because they have two alleles of each genetic locus, with one allele inherited from each parent. Each pair of alleles represents the genotype of a specific gene. Genotypes are described as homozygous if there are two identical alleles at a particular locus, and as heterozygous if the two alleles differ. Alleles contribute to the organism's phenotype, which is the outward appearance of the organism. Remember that every trait has at least two alleles, one from mother and one from the father. Examples like eye color. Eye color such as brown, blue, green, and hazel. Genes. Genes are the sequence of DNA that codes for a protein and thus determines a trait. It is the basic unit of inheritance. It consists of a sequence of DNA which is the genetic material. Genes can mutate and can take two or more alternative forms. Genes are passed on from parent to child and are believed by many to be an important part of what decides looks and behavior. A gene is a hereditary unit consisting of DNA that occupies a spot on a chromosome and determines a characteristic in an organism. A locus is a spot or address on a chromosome at which a gene for a particular trait is located in all members of a species. It can also refer to the location of a mutation or other genetic marker. A given locus can be found on any pair of homologous chromosomes. These are thread-like structures made up of nucleic acid or DNA and proteins. They are mostly found in the nucleus of the cell. They carry the hereditary or genetic information in the form of genes. Each chromosome is made of protein and a single molecule of deoxyribonucleic acid or DNA passed from parents to offspring. DNA contains the specific instructions that make each type of living creature unique. The term chromosome comes from the Greek words for color, chroma, and body, or soma. Scientists gave this name to chromosomes because they are cell structures or bodies that are strongly stained by some colorful dyes used in research. In humans and most other complex organisms, one copy of each chromosome is inherited from the female parent and the other from the male parent. This explains why children inherit some of their traits from their mother and others from their father. Now let's have the difference between the dominant and recessive allele. Dominant is an allele that will always be expressed even when there is only one of these alleles present. It is represented by a capital letter. When an allele affects the phenotype of an organism, then it is a dominant allele. Next is a recessive allele. A recessive allele will only be expressed when both alleles are of this type. It is represented by lowercase letter. An allele that affects the genotype in the absence of the dominant allele is called a recessive allele. To represent the dominant allele, I use capital letter R, and to represent recessive allele, I use small letter r. So let's have a practice. Big T represents straight hair, and small t represent curly hair. Big T represent offspring with straight hair. Big T and small t represent offspring with straight hair. And small t represent offspring with curly hair. This one is homozygous dominant, heterozygous, and homozygous recessive. Now let's have genotype and phenotype. Genotype is a description of the pair of alleles present for a characteristic. It is the complete heritable genetic identity of an organism. It is the set of alleles that are carried by the organism, and it also includes the non-expressed allele. The genotype is the genetic makeup of an organism. For example, big T, small s, big G, big G. Next is phenotype. Phenotype is the physical expression of the alleles. It is the description of the actual physical characteristics of an organism or the expressed form of the genotype. For example, curly hair, straight hair, blue eyes, tall, and green. In this example, it shows the genotype and the phenotype. Big A, or big A, small a. Small a, they are all examples of genotype. Purple flower and white flower, these are examples of phenotype. Now let's have homozygous and heterozygous. Homozygous is a term used to refer to an organism that has two identical alleles for a particular trait. For example, two big T's or two small t's. And the heterozygous is a term used to refer to an organism that has two different alleles for the same trait. For example, big T, small t. Again, Homozygous is a pair of alleles that produce a characteristic that are the same. So we have here two big R's and two small r's. And heterozygous is the pair of alleles that produce a characteristic that are different. Big R, small r. Now, one of the first people to study genetics was an Austrian monk called Gregor Mendel in the 1850s and 1860s. He experimented with thousands of pea plants and established the basic foundations of inheritance, such as dominant and recessive characteristics. Mendel studied 7 characteristics of pea plants, such as stem length, flower color, flower position, pod shape, pod color, seed shape, and seed color. Gregor Mendel, also known as the father of genetics, he conducted immense research and studies on these inheritance of traits. He researched on plant breeding and hybridization and conducted his experiment on pea plants to show the inheritance of traits in living organisms. He observed the pattern of inheritance from one generation to the other in these plants, and thus he came up with the Mendel's laws of inheritance, as law of dominance, law of segregation, and principle of independent assortment. This time, let's have the difference between the monohybrid cross and the dihybrid cross. Monohybrid cross, it is the cross between two plants which have one pair of contrasting characters. For example, a cross between a tall pea plant and a short plant. The following diagram explains this in detail. In the first generation, or F1, the progeny were tall. There was no medium height plant. In the second generation, or F2, 1/4 of the offspring were short and 3/4 were tall. The phenotypic ratio in F2 is 3:1, or 3 tall and 1 short, and the genotypic ratio in F2 is 1:2:1, or 1 homozygous dominant, 2 heterozygous, and 1 homozygous recessive. For a plant to be tall, a single copy of big T is enough, but if a plant has to be short, both the copies should be small t. In heterozygous, big T is expressed and small t is suppressed. Hence, the characters big T is the dominant trait and small t is the recessive trait. Dihybrid cross. It is the cross between two plants which have two pairs of contrasting characters. This takes into consideration alternative traits of two different characters. The F1 generation contains 100% hybrid plants because when homozygous dominant and homozygous recessive crosses with homozygous recessive and homozygous dominant, all offspring plants are heterozygous with round and yellow seeds in the first generation. Therefore, the round and yellow seeds are the dominant characters. F2, the phenotype ratio is 9:3:3:1, and the genotype ratio is a very complex one. So this shows that the genes independently inherited. Let's have some terminology. P1 or original parents, so these are the parental genotype. F1 or the first generation, when the parents breed or cross to produce the offspring or the progeny. Then the first progeny is called first filial generation or F1 generation. Now, when the first generation progeny cross or breed among themselves, they produce second progeny called a second filial generation or F2 generation. Next is Punnett square. Punnett square is a diagram showing the gene combinations that might result from a genetic cross. It is used to calculate the probability of inheriting a particular trait. Probability means the chance that a given event will occur. In this example, we have here two heterozygous parents. We have here the genotype of one parent on top and the genotype of one parent along the side, and the genotype of the offspring inside. A Punnett square simulates two organisms reproducing sexually, examining just one of the many genes that get passed on. The completed square shows every possible way the offspring could inherit this gene, and what the chances are for each result. Making Punnett square is a good way to get started understanding the fundamental concepts of genetics. So we have here the gametes of one parent and the gametes of the other parents, and then the genotype of the offspring inside the square or the box. We have 6 basic steps to completing single-cross Punnett square. In this sample problem, give the genotype and phenotype for the following cross: homozygous dominant cross to homozygous recessive. Step 1. Create a key showing traits as dominant and recessive. So in this example, we have here capital T that represent tall and small t that represent short. Each Punnett square describes how variations of a gene or alleles could be inherited if two organisms sexually reproduce. Now you may choose a letter to represent the alleles. Write dominant allele with any capital letter and the recessive allele with the same letter in lowercase. Now it doesn't matter which letter you choose. Step 2. Make a list of possible allele combinations and the phenotypes that each would produce. So in this example, we have here homozygous dominant, which is tall, heterozygous, which is also tall, and homozygous recessive or short. Step number 3. Identify the parents that are being used in the cross. So we have here the parental genotype: homozygous tall cross to homozygous short, or homozygous dominant cross to homozygous recessive. Check the parent's genotype. We need to know the genotype of each parent that has for the trait. Each parent has 2 alleles, sometimes the same one for the trait. Just like every sexual organism, so their genotype will be 2 letters long. Sometimes you'll already know exactly what this genotype is. Other times, you'll have to work it out from other information. Heterozygous means 2 different alleles. Homozygous dominant means it has 2 copies of dominant allele, and homozygous recessive means it has 2 copies of the recessive allele. Any parent that shows the recessive trait belongs to this category. Step number 4. Draw a 2x2 square. Draw a box and divide it into 4 smaller squares. Leave a room above the box and to its left so you can label it. Label the columns with the other parent's genotype. Write the second parent's genotype for the same trait as labels for the column. This is typically the males or the father. For example, homozygous dominant, write big T above each of the 2 columns. Label the rows with one parent's genotype. Label the first row of the grid with one of that parent's allele. Label the second row of the grid with the second allele. For example, homozygous recessive, small t, to the left of the first row, and another to the left of the second row. Step number 5. Complete the Punnett square. Have each box inherit letters from each row and column. The rest of the Punnett square is easy. Start in the first box. Look at the letter to its left and the letter above it. Write both these letters in the empty box. Repeat for the remaining 3 boxes. If you end up with both types of allele, it's customary to write the dominant allele first Write big T, small t, not small t, big T. For example, the top left box inherits big T from the father and small t from the mother to make it heterozygous. Top right box inherits a big T from the father and small t from the mother to make it heterozygous. The bottom left box inherits a big T from the father and the small t from the mother. And the bottom right box inherits the big T from the father and the small t from the mother. That makes heterozygous. Step number 6, write the genotype and phenotype. Identify the genotypic ratio and the phenotypic ratio. So you have to interpret the Punnett square. The Punnett square shows us the likelihood of creating offspring with certain alleles. There are 4 different ways the parent's allele can combine, and all 4 are equally likely. This means that the combination in each box has 25% chance to occur. If more than one box has the same result, add up these 25 chances together to get the total chance. In our example, we have 4 boxes with heterozygous, 25%, 25%, 25%, and 25%. So means each child has 100% chance of inheriting heterozygous genes. Now, next is describing the phenotype. Often, you are more interested in the children's actual traits, not just what their genes are. This is easy to find in the most basic situation, which is what the Punnett squares are usually used for. Add up the chance of each square with one or more dominant allele to get the chance that the offspring express the dominant trait. Add up the chance of each square with 2 recessive alleles to get the possibility that the offspring expresses the recessive trait. Now, in our example, the offspring has 100% chance to be tall. So we have here the genotypic ratio of 4:0 and the phenotypic ratio of 4:0. Remember, each box is 25%. You try it now. Give the genotype and phenotype for the following cross: heterozygous tall, cross to homozygous short. You may pause the video to answer this. Timer starts now. So here's the answer when you cross heterozygous tall to homozygous short. After completing the Punnett square, you get the genotype and the phenotype of the offspring in its ratio. For the genotype, we have 2 heterozygous or 50% and 2 homozygous recessive or 50%. And the genotypic ratio is 2:2 or 1:1. For the phenotype, we have 2 tall or 50% and 2 short or 50%, and the phenotypic ratio is 2:2 or 1:1. For your assessment, match these genetic terms to their definition. Number 1, gene. Number 2, genotype. Number 3, phenotype. 4, locus. And number 5, allele. You may pause the video to answer these. Here's the answer. Gene is the basic unit of heredity. Genotype is the full set of genes of an organism. Phenotype is the observable characteristics of an organism. Locus is the position of a particular gene on a chromosome, and allele is the alternative form of the same gene. Well done, students! I hope you had a meaningful learning with me. This has been Rosalie Custodio of Upper Bikuta National High School saying, learning science is fun, cool, and awesome. Watch out for the next video lesson and thank you for watching.